Welcome to The Wonder, exploring perspectives, rituals, and observances of modern, naturalistic, earth-revering, pagan religious paths. Here are your hosts, Yucca and Mark.
Welcome back to The Wonder, Science-Based Paganism. I'm your host, Mark.
And I'm Yucca.
And it's been a little while, and we've missed you folks, and we're glad to be back on the air. Today, we're going to talk about monsters.
Yes. And I love that we're talking about it now as we're going into the dark of winter, rather than as, kind of your spooky October topic, which is it's appropriate for them that time as well. But I think there's more kinds of monster to explore than just your spooky Halloween monster.
Yeah, for sure. The reason that we decided to talk about this today is that the day after this episode will drop is December 5th, which is Krampusnacht in Bavaria and Switzerland, parts of those Germanic countries, where Krampus, the terrible, devil-like, huge, hairy monster with big fangs, wearing chains and carrying bells and big whips to whip people with, comes marching down the street and might take your children and stuff them in his basket and go running away if they're bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so there's a lot of just very similar European figures who takes the children or the anyone who's misbehaved away in their sack or their basket or things like that.
Yeah. Yes. And of course, I mean, it seems likely that those folkloric expressions probably have pre-Christian roots,
mm-hmm.
but they definitely have that Christian overlay of you have to behave or you get punished,
right?
In them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is probably a newer part of the traditions, actually. In my experience or my conjecture, most monsters folklorically get appeased. Right.
Mm-hmm.
You give them food or you drive them away, or there's some way that you deal with the monsters so that they don't eat your family and all that good kind of stuff.
I think it'd be really fascinating to talk to a scholar about that and see, where that holds true, and are there certain cultures not so much, and does that seem to change when Christianity comes in? But it seems like a lot of that also still survived, especially thinking about like in Ireland and places like that with some of the different kinds of spirits that appeasing is still there.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
because like in Ireland, you don't want to mess with the she.
Mm-hmm.
If you run into them, then you do whatever it is that they want, and then you get away as fast as you possibly can. So yeah, monsters. And there are a bunch of different kinds of monsters when I think about it, and they kind of represent different things. Why don't you say what you were talking about before we started about
the predators?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think just thinking about it, I've always thought that we as humans, we have evolved during a time period where there were lots of creatures that would eat us. We had plenty of predators. And today we live in this really very strange time period for our species in which typically we don't really have to worry about that. I mean, I might take some bear mace with me if I go hiking in the mountains, but that's not the same reality that our ancestors would have been dealing with, where there were big shaggy things with giant teeth that might stalk you and eat you, or big birds that come out of the sky and take your kids away. Like, those were realities for us as we were evolving. And I suspect that we still remember that's still programmed into us, even though that's something that we don't necessarily deal with, but we still have that fear, we still have that awareness. And so we create these things to fit that expectation that we have.
For sure. And that's why monsters reflect the characteristics of predators in many ways. They have big teeth and long claws, and they're giant and strong, and all the things that
or
make
they're
it
hidden in the
possible.
shadows.
Yes, or
right? Yeah.
right. Yes, they're able to turn invisible, or all those kind of supernatural applications as well. And of course, the time that we ascribe mostly to the arrival of monsters is when it's dark,
Right.
because the thing that leaps out of the dark and gets you is a core trope to being human, right?
Right. Because we are diurnal, right?
Mhm.
We are active in the day. Our senses are our vision is best during the day, right? The night is that mysterious time period where the predators, yeah, maybe they could have gotten us during the day, but it'd be a lot easier to get us when we can't see them.
Sure. Yeah, so many of these kind of folkloric monster images, and you're right, they exist in various forms throughout Europe certainly, and in other places as well, where you have these kind of maniacal or diabolical kind of figures that mean us harm.
Mm-hmm.
um and in many cases, those represent core fears that we have, and the fear of being eaten or having our progeny eaten is right up there at the top of the list.
Yeah.
That's not
That's
what we
definitely very pre-human. That's been with us for a long time.
Yes, because if it wasn't, you didn't survive to reproduce and you were out of the gene pool.
Yep.
But there are other kind of monster ideas as well that go to other core fears that we have. And it's interesting, you were talking about how we're living in a time when, we it's very rare for someone to actually be killed by a predator, although about 2,500 people are killed by hippos every year.
And of course there's humans. We become our own predators.
That's where I was going, is that increasingly the scary story that has appeal and fascination for people is about monster humans.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be everything from the endless serial killer stuff
Right.
that keeps playing out there, and all the sort of crime mastermind fiction that people seem to lap up. But it can also go to historical figures. I mean, there are people who are fascinated by Hitler because he was such a monster.
Right.
You
I,
know,
th- I think also some of the popular monsters they're pretty much humans, just with maybe a little trait, like vampires. Vampires
uh-huh.
are still human, really.
Mm, yeah.
But they're a monster. Or zombies, right? They were humans, but now they're something else, right?
Right. But what do those two monsters have in common?
They're
They have
dead.
broken the rule about death being permanent.
Yeah.
They have returned from death, and we are terrified of death.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, the whole idea of like monkeying you know, with death, that's really scary. And we've got all kinds of monsters that are lined up, as you say, zombies and vampires, and various kinds of animated corpses and ghouls and all those kinds of things that really scare people. So one of the things that's really fascinating to me about all this that we were talking about before we started recording is that we do have we want some of that fear. We're
Mm-hmm.
attracted to it. I mean, the horror genre is huge. People are really, really attracted to it. And that's kind of an odd one to me,
Mm-hmm.
that we would choose to expose ourselves to things that cause the hair to rise on the back of our neck, which is a relic,
Right.
a vestige of something where we used to have fur, and it used to make us look larger when we got the goose flesh.
Mm-hmm. Which
Uh,
you can see with some of our companion animals like cats. When my cat gets spooked, he becomes there, especially his tail is just huge. You're just like,
yes.
how do you have that much fur on your body, right? But he looks a lot bigger all of a sudden, and very. I wouldn't want to mess with him when he's freaked out like that.
Right. Right. Yeah. So what is that? Our deep attraction to monsters. to the scary experience of confronting something that we feel is dangerous to us?
I think that there's a very practical reason for that. I think it goes back to that predator fascination that we see not just in humans, but in other species, where you need to learn about the dangerous thing.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe actually in real life, you don't really need to worry about vampires coming to get you, but we don't really know the difference. We just know that this is something that is dangerous. So there's a fascination, there's an interest. You learn a little bit more about it in your interest in it. And then maybe you've got a better chance to survive. So just from just a very kind of basic survival level, I think that that's important.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, obviously, being completely uninformed about this dangerous thing isn't going to do you any good. Yeah, that
Right?
does make sense. You were saying before we recorded that monkeys will evince some of this behavior.
Yeah, we've seen it in monkeys, some different fish species. I'm trying to remember the specifics on the one I was reading about monkeys, but I think it was something like there was like a snake in the box, and they would go up and peek into the box. And there was, of course, the social interaction of, oh, who's going to get close enough to do it? And we see it more in adolescents than older members.
King.
Yeah. And I think that feeds into the idea of it partially being about learning to survive, that the scary play is partly about let's learn to survive. But we still see in humans, we see it with all ages, but I think that we as a species, we keep learning our whole lives. It's not like we just learn our skills and we're done. But we add this extra layer because we're the storytellers, right? We understand the world through narrative, through myth, through story. And so I think that's probably why we add in all of the magical bits and the monster with this ability and that ability, because that's just how we think. That's how we experience things.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And one of the things about being a storytelling organism is that we're always looking to insert ourselves as a character in narratives. So, the story of when I met a vampire, or the story of, the scary thing that I saw that I escaped from, those kinds of things become important folklore that you hand on, right?
Yeah.
And of course, when it comes to those undead things, those reanimated monsters, some of that is just people's not understanding the natural decomposition process. There are like skeletons that they've found buried with a brick in the jaws to try to keep them from becoming a vampire, stuff like that in Eastern Europe. And the theory is that these bodies had not decomposed quickly enough, and that they appeared too lifelike, and that was deemed to have some kind of
Very uncomfortable.
Yes, made people uncomfortable, and so they had to do something in order to prevent it from rising up and coming to get them. Because of course, the only thing that a reanimated dead person would be interested in doing is rising up and coming to get you.
It's the thing that would be scary. That's the thing you'd be worried about, right?
Right.
If they do something else, they get up to go dance around in the moonlight, like it's a little unnerving, but it's not threatening, right?
There's a wonderful scene in the Tim Burton animated movie The Corpse Bride, where the living family and the dead family are meeting at the wedding. And there's this terrified family of living people who are shaking and quaking, and here come these skeleton people, until this little kid says, "Grandpa?" And it changes everything, of course, because it's like, oh yeah, okay, these are family people, these are people that I have a connection to, they're not going to hurt me. Yeah, I love that scene.
Mm.
Yeah, so in these Germanic places, there will be Krampus parades and so forth. People are really very serious about this. The costumes are amazing. And I would love to see the processions myself in person someday, but there's always YouTube
Mhm.
where you can see a lot of that stuff. And when we think about monsters, it occurred to me when we were kind of talking about this. The other form of monster is the kind of monsters that we find inside us.
Mhm.
The parts that we don't like, the parts that we find scary,
Mhm.
the impulses that kind of terrify us.
Of our inner demons. And if
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Hmm.
And the parts that are self-destructive to us, the parts that mean us harm and tell us bad things about ourselves, and urge us to harm ourselves and things like that. And for some people, and for me at other times in my life, that those have been life-threatening. They've been really dangerous aspects of myself. We'll put a link in the show notes to our episode from a couple of years ago about demons
Hmm.
and about naturalistic paganism demonology in a psychological sense, and working with those demons within the framework of how demons are supposed to work, right? Like you bind them and to protect yourself, and you negotiate with them in order to make a deal, all that kind of stuff. It's a pretty interesting episode. I think people will like it.
Yeah. There's also, so we talked about monsters, the other and monsters self, but I think we also go through, when you look at the movies that come out and what monsters are popular, I think on a societal level we use that as a process, like a way that we process or cope with things that are going on a societal level. Like
Yes.
like there'll be like a few years where everything's about zombies for a while, and we'll have the few years where it's about apocalypses, and I think that that's just us trying to work through the stuff that's happening on a big scale, not just the individual scale.
Right, it's cathartic, right?
Yeah.
Because you go through this emotional arc when you're in a movie, presumably, and that's what kind of defines what a good movie is, right? The level of intensity of emotion that you experience when you go through it. A movie that's kind of boring is not very good.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, we've had all these zombie movies recently, um, and also movies like Pandemic and other movies that sort of foretold the arrival of a pandemic that would sweep the world and kill people and be very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the the times that we're confronted with things that people feel powerless to confront, huge forces.
Mm-hmm.
And in that feeling of powerlessness, they seek some kind of catharsis that can help them to feel a little bit more at peace with these challenges, I
Right.
think.
And to have something that they can do, right? And maybe
Yes.
I have no idea with the brick example that you were giving, but I could imagine myself being in that situation where that it felt like you were taking a step, right? And maybe you don't believe it really, but it's that symbolic step, like what we talk about in ritual of we're gonna do this act, and this is gonna change how we feel about it, right?
Yes. 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 And you can see how in a little community, a community leader who might be completely, making this up on the fly, might have decided, okay, we're going to put this brick in their mouth. Everybody gather around. We're going to put this brick in their mouth, and then we're going to bury them face down. And that's going to prevent them from rising up. And everybody else believes it because the leader figure said it was going to happen that way and said it with authority.
Mm-hmm.
And in our rituals, we can similarly say with confidence we may not entirely believe that,
Yeah.
I am going to get this job. I'm going to have a successful high stakes meeting. I'm going to write 5,000 words this week, whatever it is.
But placebo still works, even when you know it's placebo.
Yep.
Right.
The open label placebo effect, and it's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So, and that's a lot of what we're about here, is just talking about how we can use that effect to better our lives and give us more of a sense of connection with everything that's going on around here.
Mm-hmm. Well, where else would you like to go with this? I know we had talked a little bit about the kind of winter connection, maybe winter as the ultimate predator, perhaps.
Yeah, I do think that there is something about the fact that all of these monsters seem to arise just as it's starting to get really dark.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, at least in Victorian England, a tradition of telling ghost stories around the Christmas time, the solstice time,
Mm-hmm.
which I think reflects, that sense that, the weather is howling outside and it's pitch black and it's very, very hostile to our survival.
Is that part of where our ghosts of Christmas past and present come from? Part of that tradition?
I think so. It was very normal to have ghost stories at Christmas time in Victorian England, and Dickens just capitalized on that and then created a sort of moral parable about being kind to others and being generous to those that are disadvantaged. Dickens was a radical. There were a lot of people that were not at, even though his work was widely beloved, there were people who felt that his messages were
too extreme.
Yes, that they were revolutionary,
right?
And that they threatened to topple the social order.
Well, because he was saying it's not enough just to be a fair businessman. Mm-hmm. You have got to go beyond that, right? You've actually got to take care of your fellow. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so that's actually a tradition that I've been trying to restart myself for my own celebrations and so forth, is telling ghost stories around the solstice, reading them and telling them, even though of course I don't believe in ghosts. But it's still cool, right? The monsters are still cool.
There's something about it, right? You get that little kind of tickle down your spine.
Yeah.
So
that shiver.
Yep.
Yeah, it's good.
And speaking of solstice, that's 2 weeks.
It's coming up.
Yeah, that's right around the corner.
Yeah, coming up really fast. So we'll be talking about that, of course, and how we celebrate and all the different rituals and meanings that the midwinter solstice can have in upcoming episodes. But thought we'd spend a little time with the monsters this week. Yeah.
It's definitely something interesting to think about. I haven't given it a lot of thought before, but now that we've been talking about it, I'm starting to go, I'm going to be thinking about it for a while.
It's one of those things like dancing and singing and other music making that I observe in humans, and when I try to click back to the 30,000 foot level and look down at humans as just these sort of subjects, where I have these questions about, well, why did those things evolve? They're obviously inherent in who we are because every culture has them. Right. They're not cultural. They're hardwired into us. And similarly, that dance with the scary unknown is very much something that is a part of human character. So yeah, I thought it would be a cool thing to talk about today. And of course, we can talk about singing and dancing and all those good kinds of things at another time.
We will. That'll be great.
Yeah.
So,
well,
I was going to say thank you for being here with us on the podcast, and we're happy to be back with all of you.
And a hint, if Krampus tries to whack you with his switches, if you jump at the same time, it doesn't hurt so much.
Maybe that's where all of our hopscotch and jump rope and all that stuff comes from.
Maybe so.
Is there anything you can give him? Can you trade him?
I'm not sure.
Cookies or brownies or...
I haven't heard of anything like that. And I think that that's probably mostly because the modern resurgence of the tradition, the monsters are really into being monsters. They don't want to be appeased. They just really want to be monsters. But maybe traditionally there was something that you could do in order to keep Krampus from coming to your house.
Well, perhaps that was the moral ahead of time, to behave. If Krampus is on his way, maybe it's too late, but you
Right.
could have done better earlier. So watch out, all you young generation, take us to heart. So
all right. Well, it's lovely as always talking with you, Yucca. And we'll see you all next week, folks.